Okay, we are starting. A couple of things, housekeeping. I think I've put myself on Spotlight, so I should be, yes. So if you can go back to gallery view, that way you'll see everybody. And as I said, keep your videos on if you can, because that way I get to see you, even if I'm sharing screen, I can still see you. And I'm going to share screen. Okay. The other thing is this was the source page from last week, which we're going to be using at least a part of it again. So this has actually been posted on the Torah in Motion website. So I will put the chat, I will put this in the chat so you have it, and we'll go from there. And there's, there's a lot of pieces in Tanakh that kind of can segue into current events and not segue into current events. I try to keep the learning of Tanakh as a subject into itself and try to avoid, sort of that kind of segue. So, but there's certainly points of intersection that I think will be self-evident. We spent some time going through the beginning of Perek Gimel, or the end of Perek Bet and the beginning of Perek Gimel as a whole last week, and we concluded that this is the position, perspective, the voice, as we call it, of the Nehenatan, or the one who the Mesameach, the one who wants to enjoy life, the one who wants to eat and to drink and to feel that they are kind of experiencing life to the fullest. There is a kind of both a self-serving goal here, which is to enjoy. Who's going to enjoy this world more than me? But at the same time, there is a significant amount of a religious perspective in this ideology, and we identified it from the perspective, at least at this stage, of Kohelet, and at this stage of the Neh. Now he's going to transition and morph, but for now, the notion of the Neheneh is essentially based on two foundational principles. Principle number one, Hakol asa yafeh b'ito. God created the world, God runs the world, and God controls the world. And so ultimately, Hakol asa yafeh b'ito, the entire notion of the song of the Kol Zman ve'et l'chol chayfetz is a time and a season for everything, and therefore there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot. There's a time and a place for everything. The message within the context of the pshat of Kohelet is therefore ma yitron ha'oseh b'asher hu amel, that the person has no profit, no benefit, no person can try to change the world and impact the world and do something to make a difference. He's right. That's not going to help, because ultimately he's not the one running the world. God is. And therefore, his task, says the Nenatan, man's task is to rejoice and to enjoy, and to recognize that benefit of the world, that enjoyment of the world, that's not, at this point, that's not a ideology of resignation or of negativity or of self-serving. That, on the contrary, is, he calls it matat elokim, a gift of God. He calls it miyad elokim, it is from the hand of God. Right? This is something which is desirable. Essentially, man is created in this world. God runs the world, and he's given man the world at his fingertips. And that's where the notion of, and we're going to see this, I think we talked a little bit about this in the context of creation, I believe. Where's the source? Right? We talked a little bit about this in the context of creation, that there is a medrash that says that the human being was created last in the sequence of creation, at least in Perek Aleph. It's described as creating as the last item last creation of the 6 days of creation, the Gemara in Sanhedrin quotes the Medrash that says that the reason why he was created last was Kadeshi Kanes L'Su'uda Miyad. So he should enter into the Su'uda, the meal, meaning the enjoyment and the benefit of this world, and do so last. As for example, right, imagine a king who has flesh and blood, a human king, meaning a person who's built a palace, a platrin, and made all kinds of wonderful decorations and purchased, and he's made a wonderful, beautiful palace. And he's prepared an entire feast. And when did he invite the guests? He invites the guests last. You don't invite the guests, stick them in your living room, and then go set the table and prepare the meal and check the animals and cook the food, right? You make everything ready, and then you invite the guest. Says the Gemara, that's exactly what the Rabbi did in the world. He created the world. He created all the items in the world. And the very last thing to be created, which was the pinnacle of creation, the purpose of creation, the goal of creation, says Kohelet, is the human being. And that's exactly what God says to him at the end. God blessed them. And he said to them, here's the world for you. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. We'll come back to Kivshua in a minute. And not only do I instruct mankind to be fruitful, to multiply, the world is yours, but also I've given the entire world to you for your benefit. I've given you all the herbs that yield seed. And I've given you every kind of fruit that yields seed. For you to eat, for you to receive, for you to benefit. And that is and I've given the animals also the benefit of eating. We'll talk about the animals in a minute, but essentially the message, says the Medrash, is that the human being is created last for the very purpose of the invitation to the guest. God is the host, the world is the palace, the produce of this world is the su'uda, and man's task is to echol v'shoteh, to eat and to drink, but not just to eat and drink, but to eat and drink as if they are part of the experience of God's world, enjoying God's creation. They're sitting and benefiting from the contributions of the Shekhinah of God Himself. I think we talked. Do we mention this reference in Mesilat Yesharim, where he talks about the purpose of the human being is to receive the benefit of God's presence? I think we talked about that at the end of last week. Mesilat Yesharim builds an entire philosophy around the notion that the purpose of the human being is what is Machol B'Tov B'Olam, the first opening chapter of Mesilat Yesharim, of Path of the Righteous, is Sh'adam lo niva ela lehit'anega al Hashem b'lehenot miziv shchinato. That a person is ultimately created for the purpose of delighting in God and deriving pleasure from the presence of the Shekhinah. And that notion that our purpose is to receive, to be the beneficiaries of God's presence, of God's Shekhinah, and in that sense enjoy the world He has put us into, that is the core of the position of the Nehenatan. Okay. Before we move forward in the text and kind of challenge this perspective, I wanted to expand it a little bit more, because it has an impact on how we understand Breshit Perek Aleph, right? This opening chapter of Breshit, but really it has an impact on how we understand the relationship between God and the world. And I actually want to start with a basic question. If I summarize Kohelet's perspective, that the Nehenatan essentially is somebody whose job it is, whose role it is, who sees himself as somebody who kind of eats and that's their entire world. Their entire world revolves around the physical benefits of the world. There's no kind of impact in the world. If I were to look at it just in the perspective of Kol Adam Sheyochal V'Shata, that's the purpose of the world, to eat and to drink. Is there any personality in Sefer Bereshit that comes to mind that is characterized by this notion of eating and drinking? That's the kind of their identity card, if you will. And in fact, there are two. Well, let's start with one.
Esav.
Esav. I think Esav is somebody that comes to mind very easily. Esav, who comes in from the field, and he is wrong way. No, that's not where I wanted to go. Where am I? Here. Esav, who comes in from the field, and he says to Yaakov, Aliteni na min adom adom hazeh, I want this red stuff, the soup. Ki ayef anochi, I'm tired. Therefore, it's called Edom. Yaakov says to him, if you want to eat, and sell me your Bechorah. Whatever the Bechorah means, it's unclear exactly what it refers to, but let's say some kind of legacy, spiritual legacy, role to play in the history of the world. Whatever it was Yaakov saw was a significant issue of being the firstborn. I'm going to die. What do I need the birthright for? I live in a world in which I could die tomorrow. Swear it. I say he swears it. And he gave his birthright to Yaakov. Now, this verse, Lamed Daled, is a complicated verse to translate. I don't want to get into I'll mention briefly. Yaakov natan Esav lechem unazid dashim. Yaakov, it translates here as Yaakov gave bread and lentil stew to Esav. I would urge you, if you have access to it, to read Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's commentary on this verse, because it's extraordinary. Rav Hirsch points out, and I don't know why he's the only one who points out, maybe there's others, that the Hebrew grammar has a unique role in biblical Hebrew, verbs especially. There are two kinds of Hebrew verbs in Tanakh. There is what we call the simple past tense, which is I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of the reversal vav, the vav hayipuch. Right? Verbs in Hebrew are always written out in their future tense with a vav that turns it to past tense, or vice versa. So vayomer is he said. Okay, so yomar means he will say. Vayomer, he said. That's the way verbs work in biblical Hebrew. There are a few places where the Torah wants to present what we would call in English past perfect tense, something which had happened before something else. And to do so, the text reverses and uses the simple past, what we call the simple past tense, meaning without the vav. So there are a few places in Tanakh where this appears, and it has a significant meaning. So the correct translation of this phrase, therefore, is Yaakov had given Esav the bread and the stew beforehand, meaning, says Rav Hirsch, and I think he's correct, that unlike the way most people read this text, where they're negotiating between the birthright and the soup, Esav comes in from the field, he wants the soup, and Yaakov gives him the soup, he gives him the bread, and he gives him the soup, and in the meantime, they're having a conversation, while Esav is eating his soup, they're having a conversation, and Yaakov says to him, sell me your birthright. And Esav says, fine, you can have it, I don't need it. So that the notion that he sold his birthright for a bowl of stew is actually grammatically incorrect in the text. If you are able to find Rav Hirsch's commentary on here, it's worth reading. It's an amazing piece. It's not long. But in the meantime, it says at the end, Vayochal, Vayesht, Vayakom, Vayelach, Vayives Isavat Bechorah. He ate, he drank, he got up, he left, and he scorned the birthright. Meaning everything about Esav is about the here and now. The food, the bread, the water, the eating, the drinking, the here and now. Tomorrow is irrelevant to him. And to some extent, and we're going to qualify this in a second, you could argue that that's exactly what Kohelet says. I saw that there's nothing better that man should do than just to enjoy the ride, enjoy life. That's his portion. Because tomorrow is irrelevant. Who's going to bring a person to see what tomorrow brings? Tomorrow, a person could be dead tomorrow, right? Tomorrow is irrelevant to the individual. Right? We were dust, we will be dust again. And therefore, the purpose of life is to eat and enjoy the moment. That's exactly what Esav says. These two verses, Chaf and Chabet, define Esav's ideology. Except for one problem. We didn't get up to that part of the text. We're still here at the top part of the text, which is about God and about godliness and about God runs the world. So we, to jump to Esav is a bit of a jump. Nonetheless, that seems to be what Esav represents. I would argue, however, that Esav is not the Nehenatan of Kohelet. He's an offshoot of it and a perversion of it. But he's not the Nehenatan of Kohelet. He learned his philosophy from somebody who is the Nehenatan of Kohelet. Namely, somebody else whose life revolved around eating and drinking and enjoying the world, in a sense, but from a religious perspective, not from a not religious perspective. And that would be Esav's mentor. Who is Esav's mentor? And surprisingly enough, I think it's Yitzchak. Why is Yitzchak the Nehenatan of Kohelet? So if you think about Yitzchak for a second, what do we know about Yitzchak? We don't know a lot, right? Yitzchak has very few stories about him. But what we do know is that when he comes to bless his children, right? What does he say about how to bless his children? When Yitzchak grew old, and he calls over his son Esav, and he says, I've reached the end of my life, the end of my journey. I don't know when I'm going to die. Therefore, I need to give you a blessing. So what does he ask him to do? Go and take your gear, go hunt an animal, va'aseli matamim, and make me something delicious. Make me something to eat. So I can eat it before so that I can bless you. What do we know about Yitzchak? He likes good food. He enjoys the benefit of the Esav's contributions. What else do we know about Esav? Back in Perek Chavav, he digs, or he inherits wells from Avram. Avram dug the wells, he inherited them. And we know that he is very wealthy. And he has all the wherewithal to enjoy the world. Take a look in Perek Chavav, after the whole story with the wells. Very wealthy. The Philistines grew so wealthy that the Philistines were envious of him. And at the end of the text, at the end of actually, I think it's just before that. And God blessed him, and he had his crop produced 100-fold. So there's an element of Yaakov. Sorry, let's do this again. There's an element of Yitzchak that we see in Esav. Right? It's not an accident that Yitzchak loved Esav and Rivka loved Yaakov, whatever that means. Right? Love and choosing are interconnected in Tanakh. Right? Then he saw Esav as a role to emulate or to the continuity of his philosophy, if you will. Yitzchak is somebody who literally enjoys a good meal, and that's how he starts his blessing. Right? Aseli matamim. Compare Yitzchak, and I'm going to qualify this in a second, so don't tune out until we do, because we're going to have to qualify this. But if you compare Yitzchak to Abraham, they're very different personalities. Think about it from this perspective. What do we know about Abraham? From the day Abraham enters into the conversation, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Right? From the day Abraham enters into the conversation, what do we know about Abraham? The first two words are Lech Lecha. Then he goes, he transfers to a different country. He starts to build altars. He has he's a mess. He's going from one. He has to fight wars. He has to fight wars to save his nephew Lot. He has to dig wells because Yitzchak inherits those wells. Avram is a doer. Avram is a doer. In terms of the personalities of Kohelet, there's not hard to find a line that connects Abraham and the Amal, the builder, the toiler, the one who runs around, who's always trying to make a difference in the world, the activist, if you will, to Yitzchak, who is like, sits in his house and he's just enjoying life, enjoying the presence of good food and his family. It's a little bit of an extreme description of Yitzchak, and we're going to qualify it in a second. But I think that is a very powerful distinction. Not only that, that's a distinction that's sourced in the Chumash itself. Sorry, my video just went out for a second. I'm still here. Hang on a second. There we go. All right, that is a source, an issue that is sourced in Chumash itself. You've all heard of the issue that's discussed at length in the Medrash and the Mefarshim up until contemporary philosophers of the difference between Bereshit Perek Aleph and Bereshit Perek Bet. If the notion of the Neheneh is built around the principle that because man is created last, he's sort of the recipient of God's benevolence and goodness in the world. You're eating because God put you into the world. That's what Yitzchak says. You're eating good food, and therefore I can bless you because you're eating from God's presence, right? You're eating from the food that God put in this world. That's the Suda that the Rebbeinu Shalom has created for you. That's true in Bereshit Perek Aleph. Where the world is ready, man has no task other than to receive it. That is not, however, the world of Bereshit Perek Bet. And one of the major discussions in the commentaries is why we have two versions of creation that not only present the story of creation again, but present them very differently. Whereas Bereshit Perek Aleph starts Bereshit bara Elokim, right? That's the story of creation in 6 days. In the Perek Bet, suddenly we start all over again. Eile toldot hashamayim ve'haaretz behi bar'am. Remember the parallel? I didn't put this on a page, but I'll just show it to you on the screen. Right, Bereshit Perek Aleph starts Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God created the heaven and earth, right? Shamayim ba'aretz. And Perek Bet, pasuk Dalet starts Eile toldot shamayim ba'aretz behi bar'am. It's exactly the same concept. God created the heaven and earth. God created the heaven and earth. We're going to tell the whole story again. Only this time, there's nothing in the world. There's no shrubs. There's no vegetation. There's no herb in the field yet to spring up. The world is barren. Why is the world barren? Because there's no rain. And there's no rain because Adam ayin lavot et adama, because there's no man. And therefore, Vayitzer Hashem Elokim et Adam, afar min adama. God therefore formed man, dust of the earth. Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim, blew into him his spirit of life. Vayita Hashem Elokim gan be'eden mikedem, and then God planted a garden. And he placed there man whom he had created, but Yasim Shamat Adam Asher Yatsa. So in the description of Perek Bet, man is created first. Then God creates this elaborate garden, and he places man there, and he gives him all kinds of fruits to eat and trees to have. We talked about the Eitz Hadat at length. Then there's the rivers. We'll skip those for a moment. Man places man in the garden for what purpose? In Perek Aleph, it was to be fruitful, to multiply, and to eat. Correct? Remember that? Right? The purpose in Perek Aleph was to be fruitful, to multiply, and to eat. Perek Aleph. Be fruitful, multiply, and natati lechem kol esev zarei zera, and to eat. That's the nehene. Perek Bet, God says, I've given you this garden. For what purpose? To work it, and to guard it, and to protect it, to be involved in it. That's a very different world. And in many ways, the placement of the human being in the story is the critical piece. In Perek Aleph, the placement of the human being at the end of the story is because the purpose is to receive the world. And in Perek Bet, by placing him at the beginning of the story, it's because he needs to change, he needs to guard the world, protect the world, to do something with this world that's yours. I've given you limitations. I've told you you're man and I'm God. I've given you the Eitz HaChaim but I've taken away from Eitz Hadat. We've talked about the Gan Eden story, but for the most part, Gan Eden is for the purpose of the human being to do something with. When Adam is removed from Gan Eden, what happens to the garden? It disappears. Because there's no purpose to the garden without Adam there. So from every perspective, and Soloveitchik builds this whole analysis of the difference between the human being's task as described in Perek Bet and the human being's task as described in Perek Aleph, to receive or to contribute, to whether to be a recipient of God's presence, to just be passive and to enjoy the benefits of closeness to God, versus to actually do something with this world, to make a difference in this world, to create, to build, to do. Or you can read it, it's in the Soloveitchik's book called The Lonely Man of Faith. It's an extraordinary essay, and he builds on this distinction at length. But I come back to the question. In Kohelet terminology, this individual who is eating and drinking and benefiting from the world is described by Kohelet. I'm going to look at the end. A man's future, what happens to man and what happens to animals is the same. Whatever happens to one happens to the other. And therefore, we start at dust, we end at dust. Who knows if the spirit of man goes up, the spirit of animals goes down. Therefore, there's nothing better than to eat and to drink and to enjoy the moment like the animals. Created as part of the animal kingdom. The animals eat, the animals drink, the animals live, animals die. That's exactly what man does. He eats, he drinks, and he dies. Which is a very harsh perspective on the world. And so I come back to the question of Yitzchak and Esav. What's the relationship between them? Why are they both fixated on this notion of food, ochel, as the centerpiece of their relationship? And how does that connect to what we're talking about? So let me cut right to the end and make the following assertion. Esav learned his entire philosophy from Yitzchak. Let me say that again. Esav learned his entire philosophy from Yitzchak. It's all about the soup and the food and the Nizida Dashim and not about the birthright. However, Esav learned the philosophy of Yitzchak a little bit too late. And what I mean by that is the following. Now, let's tell this little story, this little kind of vignette that about a person who gets up every morning at 4 o'clock in the morning and drinks 4 cups of vodka. And somebody said to him, well, you get up in the morning, the first thing you do before you drink 4 cups of vodka? So he said, yeah, that's how my father used to live. He used to get up in the morning and drink 4 cups of vodka. So it turns out that the real part of the story is that his father lived in the forests, and he would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he would go out into the and go tovel in the mikveh in the river that was barely frozen. And then he would say tikkun in the morning, and he would say his tefillah, and then he would go out and cut wood, and he would do whatever he needs to do. And he would come back to the house at 6 or 7 o'clock, and he was absolutely frozen to the bone. So he sat down by the fire, and he drank 4 cups of vodka to warm up. And that's when his son woke up. And the first thing he saw was his father sitting there drinking 4 cups of vodka. In other words, Yitzchak and Esav share the characteristic of living a life that is reminiscent of, as KOHELET says, there's no advantage of the man over the beast. Man is exactly like a beast, like an animal. Yitzchak was like an animal, Esav was like an animal. They ate and they drank, that was their life. With one profound difference. Yitzchak was like an animal, because he sat on the altar like an behemah with his face towards the heavens, and he lived his life in the shadow of that moment when he sat on the Mizbeach as part of the Akedah. Esav wasn't born yet. Yitzchak is profoundly different than Esav, because Yitzchak lives in a world in which he's strength and his character and his ability to recognize that he lives in a world in which God, he literally stood there with his eyes towards the heavens on the Akedah. And that's the moment that he kind of transforms Yitzchak's life into a life in which whatever happens to him happens because God runs the world. Whatever happens to him happens because, as KOHELET says, Akol asa yefeh be'ito. God runs this world. Yitzchak is the Akedah. Remember, God spoke to Abraham and told him to take Yitzchak to the Akedah. God didn't speak to Yitzchak. Yitzchak was willing to go because Yitzchak's notion, Yitzchak's gevurah, his strength, is his total 100% complete devotion to God runs this world, and whatever God does for me, I will accept. And therefore, if he provides me food, I will accept it. And if he doesn't, I'll move on to the next field or the next well. But his role in this world is literally, as Mesilat Yesharim describes it, to sit on the Mizbeach, to sit in the temple, Kivat Elokim Litov, to feel the presence of God, and to benefit literally, right? To benefit literally from the presence of the Shekhinah. That's where Yitzchak's story begins. You know, if the Medrash linked to the notion of the Neheneh, to the notion of the Oreach, to the guest, who is a guest in God's world, right? That's what the Medrash said. That's what the Gemara in Sanhedrin. A guest has 2 roles. If you're a guest in somebody's house, you're invited to somebody's house for a meal, you have 2 roles, 2 jobs. Job number 1, to acknowledge whatever the Baal Bayit, whatever the host provides for you, and to say thank you. Job number 2 is to accept it graciously, say thank you, and not to begin to challenge. Well, you should have done this, and maybe you could have done that, and maybe this course could have been a little bit better, and maybe you could have done it on this, served it on this kind of cutlery or on that kind of china. Right? You're a guest. You're a guest. You accept. You say thank you. You receive. That's the job of a guest. You recognize that you are a guest in the Rebbeinu Shalom's world. That's exactly the world of Perek Aleph. Yitzchak ultimately is the quintessential example of the gevura of the Akedah, who literally lives his life as if every moment is God is running this world, and whatever God says, I'll do. I'll give you another example. Imagine for a moment, right? Esav got half the philosophy. He got half the picture. He got the picture of there's value in the physical aspects of life. Okay, but there's also a notion that those physical aspects of life come from God, and therefore we acknowledge that they are a gift. Esav spent his whole life trying to outmaneuver his brother. Yitzchak is preparing his blessings, and he tells Esav, go out and bring me food, and Yaakov comes in, and Yaakov takes the birthright from him and takes the blessing. At the moment that Yaakov took the blessing from Esav, disguised himself as Esav, what are the next? And Yaakov realizes it. Sorry, Esav realizes it. Esav acknowledges. Sorry, let me do that again. I get names mixed up. And Esav takes that blessing, hears that Yaakov came in from the field and stole his blessing. And he turns to Yitzchak and he says, don't you have a blessing for me? Yitzchak's response is, so who was that who came in from the field and took your blessing? That must have been Yaakov. The next three words out of his mouth were, Gam Baruch Yihiyeh. He should also be blessed. Meaning, when the circumstances of life have led him to the moment where Yaakov received that blessing, Yitzchak said, if that's the way God runs the world, then that's the way I accept it. Esav, on the other hand, was furious. And Esav says, I'm going to kill my brother. Take a page out of Cain's book. The difference between the perspective of the Neneh and the perspective of everybody else is, at least at this stage, the pure version of the Neneh is the gevura, the strength that it takes to say, I accept whatever God provides and decrees for me in this world. And the moment Yitzchak hears about Yaakov and says, Gam Baruch Yihiyeh, that defines him as being able to say, whatever God, God runs this world. There's a reason why Yitzchak and the Akedah is central to the motif of Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is a day in which, what's the theme of Rosh Hashanah? What's the definition of Rosh Hashanah? We call it Yom Hadin, we call it Yom HaZikaron. And Rosh Hashanah is essentially a day of
Malchut.
Malchut Hashem. Malchut Hashem. What does Malchut Hashem mean? So there are three brachos that we say in Rosh Hashanah. One is about kingship, which is a shir into itself, and the other is about zichronot. God remembers. What does that mean, God remembers? Atazochem aseh olam. You remember the deeds of man. What does that mean that God remembers? We have in the same breath, we say, there's no forgetfulness before God. So if God can't forget, what does it mean that God remembers? Right? Interesting question. What does remembrance mean when it comes to God? So if you read this lesson carefully,
he's accountable.
Right. If you read this paragraph carefully, you'll see that it's not about remembering the way we think of memory, forgetting and remembering. Remembering means to record or to recall the deeds for the purpose of judgment, accountability. Zikaron liyom rishon kichok lisom hu mishpat lalokei Yaakov. The notion of zecher, of zikaron, and mishpat are interconnected. To remember means to decree, and to hold accountable. Therefore, Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment. Right? The Torah's description of Rosh Hashanah is not a Yom of Malchus. The Torah's description of Rosh Hashanah is a day of remembrance, Yom HaZikaron. Right? Zichron Trua, Yom Trua, Zichron Trua. the Alam Medinot, and that's exactly the deeds that come before you, and you seek the accountability before everyone. God decrees what is going to happen, right? You accept the notion of the God's decree, whatever it is, whatever God's judgment is, you accept it. That's what it means to be a guest in God's world. Whatever God decrees, you accept. Can you imagine a Rosh Hashanah if we started with, well, we'll accept your judgment, but only if it's a good judgment. If it's not a good judgment, I'm not so sure I want that. I'm going to start to plead with you to change the judgment. There's a reason why you're not allowed to say vidur in Rosh Hashanah. Even though tshuva is built around vidur and confession, you're not allowed to say vidur in Rosh Hashanah because that's all for Yom Kippur. After the court has ruled, after the decree has been made, after God has said, this is the outcome, then we can throw ourselves on the mercy of the court. And that's what Yom Kippur is all about. But we first have to accept the authority of the court to judge and to decree, and accept that decree, whatever it is. That's what the bracha of Zichronos is about. And it's at that point that we insert the story of the Akedah, because that's what defines Yitzchak more than anything else, the ability to say, whatever God decrees, I accept. That is the quintessential character of the message of Zichronot and of Yitzchak. And therefore, when Mesilat Yesharim speaks about the purpose of a human being is to literally live their life as if they are in God's dining hall. And whatever God does, he's the host, we're the guest, and we accept it, right? That's what Mesilat Yesharim says. That's exactly the philosophy of Yitzchak. Whatever God decrees, I accept. He doesn't criticize, he doesn't challenge, he doesn't act, he doesn't try to change it. I shared with you the conversation last week, the conversation between Rabbi Akiva and Turnusufus, where Rabbi Akiva, where Turnusufus challenged Rabbi Akiva because all the mitzvah and Bismillah says that you're going to change the world. And Turnusufus says, God created the world. What are you playing with it for? What are you changing it for? And Rabbi Akiva had to kind of challenge him back and say, well, God created the world for us to make an impact. But that's, right, and he uses the example of making bread. But that's not the neheneh, that's the amal, that's the chacham, that's all of the other personalities of Kohelet. The nehenatan philosophy starts from the ideology that hakol asa yafeh bito. I cannot stress this enough. We're going to challenge it in a minute, and then we're going to undo it and move to a different perspective. But it all starts from this song, L'kol zman ve'et l'cho chefetz tachat hashamayim. Everything has a time, a place, a season under the heavens. This is all God's making. God determines the timetable for the world. God runs the clock of the world. I saw the entire world. God makes everything perfect in its time. We don't know it. We don't understand it. This is beyond us. Our job is to Our job is to receive it and receive it graciously. That's the Yitzchak. Esav missed that whole shear. He missed the whole piece. This is the Yitzchak. That when we are eating and drinking and enjoying this world, we make a bracha because we recognize that it comes from God. Not sure Esav made a bracha on his bowl of soup. That's the difference. Okay. However, that philosophy has an enormous, gaping flaw in it. And Kohelet is not unaware of it. He's just kind of getting us there step by step. And the flaw in that philosophy is the following. Starting with Pasuk Tet Zayin. Od ve'iti tachat hashamesh. Another piece of the story that I saw under the heavens. Makom mishpat shama haresha. In the place of justice, there is wickedness. Umakom tzedek shama harasha. And in the place of righteousness, that wickedness was there. What's the flaw in the story? The theology of Asa, of Yitzchak, the gevura of Yitzchak, to receive, to accept, to say, whatever God does, that's the world, and I accept it, and I live by it, works. Hakol asaya febito, God created a perfect world, works in the world of Breshit Perek Aleph. And it works in the world of Breshit Perek Aleph because there's man and there's nature. What isn't there? What's not in Breshit Perek Aleph?
Evil.
Evil? Take it one step further before I get to evil.
Other people with free will.
Death
The
is not there yet.
the snake isn't there.
The snake isn't there.
People are not there. Man is not there.
No.
Nobody's there. Nobody's there. There's no society. There are no other people. There's Adam, and that's it. Maybe it's Adam and Chava, Zachar and Nekeva, and the world of nature. And in the world of nature, the God created a perfect world. But the moment you introduce any kind of element of society, the notion of is God is in control, and you have no ability to change the world. Your job is
You're
to.
pretty good.
Hang on a second. Sorry about that. Let me just. Right. Your job is not to change the world, but to accept the world as it is. Works in a world of nature, maybe. It doesn't work in a world of society. And that's what Perek Bet introduces us to. Introduces us to the notion of there are other elements in this world. There's temptation, there's the Nachash, whatever the Nachash represents, but suddenly there's other people too. And suddenly I'm outside of the garden, and suddenly I have Adam, and I have Chava, and I have the Nachash, and I have egos, and I have blames, and I have accusations, and I have challenges, and then I have Cain, who kills his brother, and then I have Lemech, who creates tools of war, and the Bnei Elohim at the end of Sefer Bereshit that we just Parsha Bereshit that we just read, who are abusing women and who are stealing who they want, and before you know it, I have a world that is degenerated into violence and corruption and evil, and that's the story of the end of Parsha Bereshit. At the moment Adam and Chava find themselves outside the world of Gan Eden, the end result is in the beginning of Perek Vav. The sons of God, which is usually a reflection of some sort of people of power, right? The word El means somebody of power, right? So would take who they want, and you had Nephilim Ba'aretz, and you had corruption, and you had they would Vayar Hashem ki ba'at Adam Ba'aretz, and God saw that man was evil, and then humankind had degenerated. The world of the philosophy, let's put it into Kohelet philosophical terms. The notion that God runs this world means, that's the concept of bitachon, right? I'm totally dependent upon, right? Whatever God does, I accept. God has a plan. I don't know the plan. Whatever it is, I accept. Okay, so if there's a prohibition in the Torah of lo tikom v'lo titor, not taking revenge. Some of the Mefarshim explain the mitzvah of not taking revenge based on the notion that everything has a plan. God runs this world, so everything has a reason. So if somebody does me wrong, there must be a reason for it. So I accept it, and I'm not going to act vengefully back. That's the philosophy. Fine. It's very nice. Flip it around for a minute. I do something wrong to somebody else. And now you come and say to me, how could you do that? What's my answer? If God didn't want that bad thing to happen, he wouldn't have put me in that position to make it happen in the first place. Right? I pulled the trigger. If God didn't want the person to die, he wouldn't have let the bullet reach its destination. You try that in a court of law. The notion of bitachon, the notion of hashgacha, of reliance that God runs this world and ultimately everything has a place and everything has a time and everything is as a season and God runs this world and it's all, it's gamzu l'tova, this is all for the best. It has a limitation. Because I can throw up my arms and say, I can let evil run rampant and not do anything about it because God runs the world. Or even worse, I can perpetrate the evil and then throw up my hands and say, God runs the world. Don't blame me, blame God. The moment you take the human being out of a world in which the only two things that exist are man and nature and put him into a world of society, you can't allow the human being to absolve himself of responsibility for his actions. There needs to be a sense of accountability. And that's exactly where this philosophy fails. And so, Kohelet says, where there's mishpat, where there are people, where there's resha, now I have a problem. Who's going to hold the wicked accountable? So what are my options? What are my options? Remember who's speaking. The Neheneh is speaking, the Nenatan. And the philosophy of the Nenatan is that our job is not to impact, change, or control. Our job is not to change the world God created, but rather to receive it. So now I have a problem. I have wickedness in the world. I have evil in this world. Whose job is it going to be to hold the wicked accountable in this world? If you say man, right? If you say man, which is what the story of the Mabul was about, right? The story in Chumash is that that's exactly the conclusion of the flood. The conclusion of the flood was shafech dam, 6 words. I'm going to summarize the entire story of the flood. I can do it in 6 words. Shafech dam ba'adam, shafech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yishafech. A man who spills the blood of his fellow, by man shall he be held accountable. The conclusion of the flood is, God says to Noach and his descendants, this world is yours, now you're responsible for it. But that's not Kohelet. Kohelet is working with a philosophy right now of God is in control and our job is to receive. And if I take the notion of human evil into the equation, or wickedness, which is in the context here is what he's talking about, then who's going to hold the person, the Russia, accountable? And so to be consistent in the philosophy of the Neheneh, the answer is God. Amarti ani b'libi et hatzadik ve'et harasha yishpot Elokim. Okay, so God will have to hold the wicked and accountable, and the righteous will have to have his reward. That'll happen. Where and when? Yi'et l'chol chefetz v'al kol ha'ma'aseh sham. Because there is a time for every purpose there. I want to do this again. Yi'et l'chol chefetz v'al kol ha'ma'aseh sham. This is really an extraordinary text because it's one of those places in Kohelet which is so consistent. How does the opening of this passage begin? Let's do it on this page. It's easier to see. How does it begin? L'kol zman ve'et l'chol chefetz tachat hashamayim. There's a season and a time for everything under the heavens. He's talking about this world. Suddenly, he's faced with the contrast of mishpat and resha. So what's his conclusion? Ki et l'chol chefetz. It's exactly the same phrase he used above. Right? Et l'chol chefetz, l'kol zman ve'et l'chol chefetz. Same phrase. Only this time, the mishpat is not here. Where is the mishpat? There. And here I'm going to share with you, and this will be, we'll conclude with this, but we'll kind of, it will be a segue into next week. Kohelet is the first sefer in Tanakh to articulate an explicit reference to the concept of a mishpat, a judgment and accountability, not in this world, but in the next. What does the word Sham mean? How does the story of creation begin? Bereshit Perek Aleph. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God created, what does the word Shamayim mean? Heavens. I'm not sure what that means. What is Shamayim? So the Mefarshim are very bothered by this word. What does it mean, Shamayim? Rashi says it comes from the word Mayim, mixture of Shamayim, right? The waters above, waters below. Says this for, and you don't have this on the source page, so I'll show it to you here. Says this for now. Where's this for now? Let's find this for now. I need this for now. Where's this for now? What's this for now? Here we go. Says this for now. What does the word Shamayim mean? Hine milat sham. The word sham means makom rachok, a very far away place. Now, you're all familiar with the Hebrew grammar of pairs, something which is a singular. If I put it into a pair, takes on a different grammar, right? So I have the difference between pairs and plural. In plural, I can have the kisei, kisaot, shulchan, shulchanot. I can have many. Things that come in pairs, like yad, hand, is a pair of hands, right? Has a different plural format. What's the plural of yad?
Yadayim.
Yadayim. Plural of regel, I have two. So the plural of regel is raglayim. I have two eyes. Einayim. Etc. The ayim ending, says this foreigner, is a symbol of a pair, something which is double. So the word sham means there, far away. And the rabbim, the plural form of the ayim, the plural form, reflects the notion of shnayim shavim, two equal things. And therefore the word shemayim means doubly distant, doubly there. Bereshit bara, that's what we call the heavens. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God created the world below and the world above. We say this in Tehillim. Hashamayim, the heavens, shamayim la'Hashem. Ve'haaretz natan livnei adam. We live in the world below. God lives in the world there. That's what Shemayim means. The world there. Where? There. It's not in this world. It's not in this existence. It's in the next world, what we call the next world. Somewhere out there. But the fascinating thing about creation is, what's the next word in the pasuk bet? Haaretz hayta tohu vavo. The earth was vacant, void, darkness, etc. God had to create light. God created light, and he created water, etc. Where does the Torah go back to a description of the creation of Shemayim? Doesn't. In other words, the Torah starts, God created Shemayim there and Aretz here. And the world of the Torah, the world of the Navi, the world of Tanakh, the world in which we live in is the world of Haaretz, this world. We don't know anything about the next world, other than that it exists, Shemayim. The rest of the story of history is the story of Haaretz. Shemayim, Shemayim la'Hashem. Shemayim is given to God. The Haaretz natan livnei adam. God gave us the Haaretz. We are responsible for what goes on in the Haaretz. That's our perspective. Kohelet introduces us to a whole new idea. And the idea that Kohelet introduces us to is, where was it? God will judge the wicked. Where? When? Sham. And the rest of Kohelet is going to struggle with this assertion. Can there be a notion of relinquishing all responsibility for evil and wickedness in this world because we are relying on God to hold the human being accountable in the next world? We've all heard it, right? We've all heard the philosophy that says that the wicked who prosper and the righteous who suffer, yes, but in the world to come, everything gets leveled out. God will punish the wicked and God will reward the righteous in the world to come. We've all heard it. This is where it comes from. That's exactly what he's saying. God will judge. God will hold accountable every righteous person, every wicked person. Where? In the world to come. Sham. And that would work, except for one problem. If all accountability for good and evil takes place in the next world, then that leaves a gaping hole in the meaning, purpose, and experience of living in this one. If man is just to receive the world as is and has no role to play in impacting and making a difference and addressing the wickedness and addressing the oppressed, if man has no role to play in the contribution and the holding of account and holding accountable the wicked and to in reward the righteous, to do what we can to create that sense of equity, then this world loses all meaning. And so Kohelet can't stop here. This can't be the end of the line. There needs to be a response, and we're going to see that response, B'ezrat Hashem, in the next week or two, as we explore what the Nene has just done. He has literally taken the notion of, I accept that God created this world, runs this world, to the extreme, by absolving the human being of all accountability and responsibility. That can't stand, and so we will see the challenge that it has over the couple of responses that come next. Okay, that's what we're up to for today. I will stop here, and if people have questions, we're happy to take them.
Thank you very much.
There's a lot to process there. I get it. We will just stay tuned. You got to come back, otherwise you end up with a very distorted picture.
Hi, Rabbi Shulman.
Yeah.
It's
Yes.
Irene from Manchester with all my
Yes,
family in
Irene.
Israel at the moment, living there. Now,
Okay.
please don't take offense, but I can't accept that it sounds as if what Kohelet is saying is that there's a good reason for what happens to us all the time. And you're saying that when we are in an existential threat at war, or at least that's what you seem to be saying, what Kohelet said.
No. So
Right, okay.
So let me come back to what I said from the very beginning, which is Kohelet is an exploration of ideas. What I don't subscribe to is the notion that Kohelet conveys a single perspective. Kohelet is a conversation. This is what we started from the very beginning. A conversation between four personalities, of which only one ends up being in line with Jewish traditional philosophy, and we haven't encountered them yet. That's the Arei Elokim. The Nene's perspective is deeply flawed. I'm not saying that it's not deeply flawed. I am saying that's what the text reflects at this moment in the text. You follow? But that is exactly what. Go read the next chapter. Now go read chapter 4.
I have read it. I've studied it because of Ibn Ezra.
Exactly.
I mean, I do know Kohelet. I'm not stupid.
So that's exactly what happens in the next chapter. The next chapter comes, whoever's speaking in the next chapter, which in this case will be the Amal, will come back and say, if that's the world you've created, I can't live in it. But that's the dialogue here. That's the tension between the personalities. But in order to be able to understand one, I need to know the pluses and the minuses of the other. Essentially, what Kohelet has done is he started with Yitzchak and he's ended up with Esav.
Well, I'm glad this is in a group of friends because I was on a recent thing with another part of America with the deputy mayor of Jerusalem. And I was telling her that Israel had to ban the BBC as it did in 2003, because it's actually not just, it's pro-Hamas. And she said she was on tomorrow, but sometimes you take things out of context. I have followed everything you've done, sometimes, recorded, but I just think it's good that you cleared that up, because I know Kohelet, and sometimes if you take it out in context, it can give the wrong impression. So thank you very much for that.
Exactly, that's the whole point of this approach.
Yes,
is that
thank you very
is
much
essentially
indeed. Yes,
out
I
of
wasn't
context.
attacking you. I just wanted to be clear, because I've got both daughters on the front line in North and South at the moment, and it's very scary. Right, thank you very much.
No problem at all. All right.
Rabbi, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Have you ever come across the book by Deborah Band, Kohelet? She's an artist, and she's if you Google it, it's very interesting. She took the whole book of Kohelet and did it in artwork and give her statements about the art.
Interesting. Okay, I'll take a look.
Yeah, it's called Kohelet by Deborah, Debra Band, BAND.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Stay safe, everybody. Be well, everybody, and
Thank you, Rabbi.
prayers for peace for everybody, and have a wonderful week. We'll see you all next week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Be well.
So what?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,